Every year, ocean giants cross thousands of kilometers. It's not a choice, it's survival. Between icy waters and tropical seas, each tail beat consumes vital energy. Along the way, predators watch, storms brew, and the youngest pay the highest price. This is whale migration, one of the most demanding processes of life in the oceans. The migration of humpback whales connects feeding grounds in cold waters to tropical breeding regions. This journey can exceed 8,000 kilometers. During the trip, they reduce their food intake and rely on accumulated fat reserves, making each decision regarding route and pace energetically critical. And as the journey progresses, energy consumption begins to define the limits of that journey. During migration, whales use environmental landmarks to maintain their course. Magnetic fields, the position of the sun, and the characteristics of ocean currents help with orientation. Deviations cost energy. For females with calves, maintaining an efficient route is essential to completing the journey. And as they progress, small corrections begin to have big consequences. Migration demands a high expenditure of energy. Humpback whales can go weeks without feeding, using fat reserves accumulated in feeding areas. For young or weakened individuals, the margin for error is smaller. Maintaining adequate speed, direction, and rest becomes crucial to completing the migration. Throughout their migration, whales traverse areas with varying ocean conditions. Contrary currents, temperature changes, and increased sea agitation raise the cost of movement. Adjusting depth and pace reduces fatigue, but prolongs travel time and exposes the groups to new risks. During migration, whales share the ocean with other mobile species. The presence of seabirds and schools of fish indicates biologically active areas, but can also attract predators. Recognizing these signs helps groups adjust their route and reduce risky encounters, especially when calves are involved. The migratory routes of whales cross the territories of large marine predators. Orcas accompany these movements, exploiting opportunities, especially when there are calves. Most encounters do not result in an attack, but their mere presence alters the behavior of the groups and imposes constant vigilance. If you enjoy this type of content exploring wildlife, support us by subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you can follow our upcoming journeys through the most extreme environments on the planet. During migration, offspring represent the most vulnerable part of the group. Females adjust speed, depth, and position to reduce exposure to predators and excessive exertion. Keeping the offspring close to the adult body decreases energy expenditure and increases the chances of traversing long stretches of the route. As they move, some migratory routes bring whales closer to coastal areas. In these areas, the shallow seabed, the natural traffic of other species, and the variation in currents require constant adjustments. For females with calves, choosing when to approach the coast can reduce exertion, but it also increases exposure. During migration, group cohesion is maintained through acoustic signals and body positioning. Low-frequency sounds travel long distances across the ocean and help maintain contact between separated individuals. For females with offspring, this communication reduces the risk of dispersal in dynamic environments. Throughout their migration, whales traverse regions with distinct climatic conditions. Rapid changes in wind, water temperature, and sea state influence the pace of their movement. Anticipating these variations allows them to reduce physical exertion and avoid areas where rough seas compromise the efficiency of their journey. If documentaries like this one resonate with you, subscribe to the channel and keep following our upcoming adventures. Although migration is continuous, whales alternate periods of movement with phases of less exertion. Temporary reductions in speed and adjustments in depth allow them to conserve energy. For females with calves, these micropauses are essential to keep the group cohesive and avoid excessive wear and tear along the route. As the migration progresses, whales gradually cross different latitudes. Water temperature increases, biological composition changes, and group behavior adjusts. These transitions indicate proximity to breeding areas, but the movement still requires strict energy management and constant attention to the environment. As they approach tropical areas, the whale's behavior begins to change. Migration slows down, and groups become less linear. In these regions, the priority shifts from movement to reproduction, protecting offspring, and choosing areas with fewer predators. In tropical areas, males compete for access to females. The competition involves approaches, blocking each other's path, and body displays, with occasional physical contact. These episodes increase energy expenditure and can disrupt groups with offspring, which tend to keep their distance to reduce risk and mechanical stress in the water. In the breeding areas, the pups are born. Birth occurs in warm, shallow waters, reducing heat loss. In the first few days, the pup is completely dependent on its mother for locomotion and protection. Each initial movement contributes to the muscle strengthening necessary for future migration. In the months following birth, the offspring grow rapidly. Breast milk is highly energetic and sustains this accelerated development. For the female, this represents a high physiological cost as she continues without feeding. The balance between protection, rest, and locomotion defines the success of this phase. As the pup grows, its stay in tropical areas becomes limited. The female needs to begin the return journey before her energy reserves are depleted. The timing of the departure directly influences the pup's survival, as it must be sufficiently developed to withstand long journeys in colder waters. The return journey marks the beginning of the most demanding phase. Now, in more open waters, mothers and calves face extensive distances, falling temperatures, and less predictable environment. The calf, still developing, needs to keep pace with the female's need to reach areas rich in food. During the return journey, mothers and offspring face new challenges. Stronger currents and progressively lower temperatures increase the physical exertion. The still developing offspring needs to maintain a steady pace, while the female balances her own exhaustion with the need to move towards feeding areas. During the return journey, the puppy goes through an intense learning phase. Adjusting speed, position, and depth becomes essential to keep up with its mother. These behaviors are not just instinctive, but refined through daily repetition. Each correction improves the efficiency of movement and reduces the risk of exhaustion. If you've been following us this far, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking, and sharing this video. Your support allows us to continue documenting new journeys like this one. As they move to higher latitudes, the energy cost of migration increases. Water temperature drops, currents intensify, and the need to maintain a constant pace becomes critical. For the female, the balance between conserving energy and sustaining the offspring enters a crucial phase. As the feeding grounds approach, the environment begins to change again. Ocean productivity increases, indicating a greater availability of prey. For the female, reaching these zones is crucial to ending the prolonged fast. For the pup, it is the beginning of contact with colder and more biologically active regions. Upon reaching feeding grounds, whales resume an essential behavior, ingesting large volumes of prey. After months of fasting, this return is gradual. The female prioritizes replenishing energy reserves, while the calf observes and begins to recognize patterns associated with the most productive zones. In feeding areas, efficiency becomes a priority. Whales adjust timing, depth, and direction to better exploit prey concentrations. In some cases, feeding occurs in a synchronized manner, reducing individual energy expenditure. For the calf, observing these patterns is part of the essential learning process for future survival. With a regular feeding schedule established, the whale's behavior stabilizes. Their routes become localized, their dives more predictable, and their energy expenditure is compensated for by the continuous ingestion of prey. For females that arrived exhausted, this phase is crucial for physical recovery and the sustained growth of their offspring. With continuous feeding, signs of recovery become evident. The gradual gain in body mass improves thermal efficiency and endurance. For the cub, remaining in these areas promotes accelerated growth and greater autonomy. The critical phase of migration begins to recede. With the female's recovery and an abundance of food, the pup begins to explore its environment more independently. Coordination improves, dives become longer, and responses to the group become more precise. This phase prepares the young pup to face future movements without constant dependence on its mother. In feeding areas, whales begin to interact more frequently. Proximity fosters collective learning, especially among young whales. Coordinated movements, responses to dives, and positional adjustments are observed and replicated. This interaction contributes to feeding efficiency and the calf's integration into the group. With the migration complete, the whales enter a phase of seasonal stability. Remaining in feeding areas allows them to fully replenish their energy reserves. Movements become local and predictable. For the calf, this period consolidates physical strength, coordination, and endurance before the next migratory cycles. As the season progresses, the whales maintain intense feeding to maximize their reserves. The environment remains predictable, but the biological cycle is not interrupted. The calf displays strength and coordination suitable for long journeys. Even in apparent stability, preparation for the next migration is already underway. With months of continuous feeding, the young animal reaches a functional level of maturity. Muscle strength, buoyancy control, and cold resistance approach adult standards. Although still dependent on the group, its ability to move and respond to the environment indicates preparedness for the challenges of future migratory cycles. With the prolonged presence of whales, the ecosystem enters a predictable cycle. Intense feeding coincides with peaks of ocean productivity. Local routes repeat themselves, diving schedules stabilize, and the environment begins to dictate the daily rhythm. It is a phase of equilibrium between organic demand and natural supply. With replenished reserves and a stable environment, the annual cycle is complete. Feeding, growth, and recovery ensure the species' survival. For juveniles, this period defines the physical and behavioral foundation necessary to face future migrations. The ocean follows its rhythm, repeating patterns that sustain life on a planetary scale. With the annual cycle completed, the species' continuity depends on the success accumulated throughout the journey. Young individuals who survived migration, return, and adaptation to feeding areas now possess the physiological and behavioral basis to repeat the process in subsequent years. Migration is not an isolated event, but a pattern transmitted between generations. At the end of this cycle, the whales remain in their feeding areas, with replenished reserves and stable behavior. Migration follows natural patterns linked to climate, food availability, and reproduction. These movements structure the survival of the species and are maintained across generations in the world's oceans. If this documentary helped you better understand life in the oceans, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. New stories about the most extreme environments on the planet continue to be produced. This video is a visual and narrative recreation made with the support of artificial intelligence for educational and entertainment purposes. The scenes are illustrative and may not accurately represent real animal behavior or the environments depicted.